Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. First, this is the Variety Trial Workshop. I'm Jared Zystro with Organic Seed Alliance, and this is Steve Peters, also with Organic Seed Alliance, and we're going to talk a little bit today about how to conduct a meaningful trial. And what we mean by that is thinking about the principles and practices so that at the end of the day, you're able to answer questions that are important to you on your farm. You're able to make good informed choices about varieties that you want to grow. And that really comes down to good planning and good execution. And so I'm going to cover kind of the first half of it about planning, and then Steve's going to jump in and talk about sort of execution and evaluation. And at any time, we have time for questions. Feel free to jump in with a question in the middle, and we'll also have questions, time for questions at the end. So, just big picture, why do farmers conduct trials? There's many different reasons. When we're thinking about variety trials, ultimately, you may be just wanting to learn which varieties perform well on your farm overall. So is this something that would fit in your farm, replace something that's currently existing? You're considering entering into a new crop or new market. You want to just be able to know what's out there and what does well in your farm system. You may also be looking for kind of specific traits in terms of quality traits. Or you might be looking for varieties that have resistance to specific stresses that you might be encountering or anticipate encountering more of in the future. Big picture again, thinking about planning the trial. There's a picture of Steve here in the, inside in the winter, thinking about the future. Just like any crop planning, spending time up front is going to pay dividends throughout the year. So, some of the things that you want to look at and consider are prioritizing your trials. So ultimately, you won't be able to be conducting, most likely, trials with every crop that you grow every year. So you want to be able to invest your time and labor wisely. So prioritizing, okay, what species is it? Do I have some burning questions about? Do I need to solve a problem? Is it really important to my farm? If I can make even small improvements in this crop category, it can make a big difference for me. The more likely that you're working with something that's really important to you, the more likely your trial is going to succeed because you're going to ensure that it succeeds. Related to that is thinking about the primary goals, and we'll go into that in a little more depth in a minute, but it's important with every trial to have somewhat clear goals in mind. What are the questions that at the end of the season you'd like to be able to answer? After that, once you sort of know what your crop and crop type is and what your goals are, that's going to help kind of filter you towards what seed sources you use, what varieties you want to work with. And I'm going to go into that in more depth in a minute. You also want to think about where you're going to put your field, where you're going to put your trial site. And again, I'm going to go into that more. And you want to make sure that you've got the infrastructure and the labor available for you, and think about when you're going to need that labor, when you're going to need that infrastructure, and how well it integrates in with the rest of the field season. This is always a challenge with any kind of sort of on-farm research project you might be conducting, is that it's often in competition with something that's paying you, dollars today. And so if you don't plan ahead and ensure you've got the labor when you're deciding between, the crops that are going to farmers market, and the variety trial, the variety trial is going to get second, fiddle. And that's, you're going to end up with something that you've invested all this time in and then had to drop in the middle of the season. So thinking ahead of time, planning for extra work, planning for extra infrastructure is going to help you be successful. So what varieties go into the trial? This really, again, it's going to depend on what your trial goals are. This can be, so if you're working with an entirely new crop category, this might be a pretty wide initial screening of varieties at first, where you're, have relatively little personal information about this crop, and you're just trying to get a quick handle on a lot of different material. So, in this case, how are you deciding what this is? It could be, what are your your standards? So, talking, if you haven't grown this crop before personally, talking to your neighbors, finding out what they grow, talking to the other farmers at the farmers market. It's going to be looking at, getting on the phone with seed companies, asking them, okay, what are some of your best sellers for this crop category in my region? A strategy we've used at Organic Seed Alliance is sometimes to find some of the best workhorses is, you call up the wholesalers or the major retailers that are buying direct from farmers. You call them up and you say, hey, who's the best producer that you have for, XYZ, for yellow storage onions or something like that. And then you get on you get their contact information, you get on the phone with them and say, what do you grow? And so these are ways to get, make sure you've got the top material in there. But then also looking at, kind of the things that are new that maybe don't have a long track record but have potential to be worthwhile, the things that, just popped into the seed catalogs recently, or even, depending on what your goals are, things that maybe even aren't fully released yet if you're, want to talk to, university plant breeders or seed companies about, more experimental material. And then looking at kind of the older standards, the heirlooms and material that's, been around for, in the trade for 15, 20, 30 plus years, there's often a reason these haven't been dropped. And so including those in there, is also useful. So again, it depends on what your goals are. You can go really wide if you're focused on a new crop category. If you're interested in potentially doing seed production, which is what we work in a lot, then you're thinking about, okay, which of these are open pollinated varieties that I could save seed of. If you're going more narrow, you already know what your, you already know this crop pretty well, then, you're going to want to narrow down, instead of having a dozen things or more in your trial, maybe you're only dealing with, 2 or 3 or 4, new things. And so that way you can grow larger plots, side by side with kind of your current standard. And so sort of the scope and scale of what goes into your trial is going to depend on what those goals are ultimately. This is a slide from Steve, and I'll mention it, but you can feel free to jump in, Steve. When you are thinking about where to source the material, it's worth doing your homework on the seed source. So part of this is just as far as, again, what your trial goals are. If you're an organic grower and you're hoping to use more organic seed, or your certifiers are asking you to use more organic seed, obviously you're going to be needing, wanting to look into seeing what's out there available in organic seed. So looking at conventional versus organic seed. If you're hoping to do seed saving or plant breeding or seed production, you're going to want to look at sort of, what's the ownership, what's sort of the intellectual property around those varieties, or is it something, that's a hybrid versus an open pollinated variety that you could save seed of. In addition, and pretty much across the board, especially, and in particular when you talk about working with open pollinated varieties, something that's useful to keep track of is not just the name of the variety, but the actual source of that variety. There's more than one, Brandywine tomato out there. There's more than one, rhubarb chard out there. And depending on the source of that, the variety can be quite different. And so knowing that, and even, from year to year, a retail seed company, a seed company that you're buying from, they may be changing the source that they're buying from. And so contacting the seed company that you're buying from and saying, where did this lot of seed come from? Who was the producer of the seed this year? So that way you can keep track of. And if you found, a particular strain that you really liked, you can make sure and try and find that again in the future. Because we've definitely done variety trials where even, from one year to the next, we've grown something, same variety name, same seed company we bought it from, vastly different performance because, and we called and we're like, why does this thing look so bad this year when it looked so good last year? It's like, well, last year we bought it from, we always used to buy it from XYZ, producer, but they weren't carrying anymore, so we switched to, another producer. And, that change meant that the variety had been maintained, at different quality standards. And so knowing that, when you're dealing with open pollinated varieties, if you're going to invest all the time and effort into doing a trial, you'd like to know exactly what you're looking at, so that way if you find something good, you can try and find it again.
And I'll just say one other thing. I've listed up here in some cases an individual who actually did a selection or breeding, and the reason why I'm bringing that up is it's really instructive to go back to that breeder or that person who's maintained it to learn more about the variety and get some of the details, like what happened with that variety. For example, like Newburgh onion here, which is actually you see it now in the market quite a bit. Well, that started out 20 years ago. It was actually came out of an old Limagrain variety called Burgos that Alan Capular actually dehybridized over about F7, 7 generations until we finally released it. And so it's very instructive to go back if you can identify who actually got their hands on it. That really helps.
So next piece of in planning a trial and setting it up is thinking about how it's going to be laid out. And so there's a couple things I wanted to hammer home. Again, if you take away, a couple of points from this whole talk, one of them is that it can be really easy to go through the effort of conducting a trial and at the end of the day not have really answered the questions that you wanted to answer. And so a lot of setting up your trial right is helping, feel confident that you actually saw real differences between the varieties once, when you get to the end of your field season. And so one of the real tools, this is secret of science here, is this idea of replication. So rather than just growing, say you're growing, in this case, 5 different varieties. Rather than just growing those 5 different varieties in your field side by side, grow them, each of those 5 varieties, in more than one place in your field. So, for example, this is just numbers. This would be variety number 1 is grown here, and grown there, and grown there. Variety number 2 is grown there, and grown there, and grown there. And the reason for this is that way. Sometimes what you have is, as you all know, you have fields that are not necessarily uniform. You've got spots where it's rockier, spots where you made a turn with your compost spreader and a little bit extra dumped out. Spots that are where the overhead irrigation isn't quite reaching as well, and spots that are right next to the standpipe that are getting water dumped on them. And so because there's all of this variation in the field, if you don't replicate, if you don't grow those varieties in more than one place in your trial, then it can be really easy to think that a variety is really good or really bad just by the coincidence of where it was in the field. So by replicating, you have a better sense of, okay, if variety number 3, looked good here, and it looked good there, and it looked good there, you start to have more confidence that this really was because that variety was better, and not just a coincidence of where it was in the field. So applying this idea of replication, even, frankly, this shows what we would call 3 replications, even just replicating twice, at least replicating twice gives you a chance to have a sense of how much you don't know. What I mean by that is if you don't replicate at all, then the only information you have is that, 5 looked really good, variety number 5 looked really good, and variety number 3 looked really bad. That's all you know. And so you can be sort of overconfident in your results and say, boy, yeah, there were some real differences there. Even just doing it a single time, then you might start to see, oh, well, it looks like actually, number 5 looked really good here, but it looked really bad over here. Why is that? And now all of a sudden you start to have a little bit maybe of helpful doubt about your results. And contrastingly more confidence if things look consistent. So I would say even just doing 2 replications is going to make a big leap in terms of the quality of your trial. The other piece of this is trying to, and this is always hard, but this plays back into the same goal of feeling confident at the end of the season that that the differences you saw between the varieties really are because those varieties are different and not just because parts of your field are different. You want to think hard about where you put a trial in your field. And this, again, is this push and pull because often variety trials are, you're not making as much money from them. Even if you're harvesting them for, a good market, that some of this stuff isn't going to be very good and going to be less marketable. It's not, going to be all, the best, variety. And so variety trials often, it's very tempting to put them in the corner, to put them, somewhere where, that's not your prime ground. Because your prime ground, you want to save that for your cash crops. But if you put it in the corner, you put it by the, field road, you put it underneath the, the black oak trees, you put it,
Walnuts, black walnuts.
Black walnuts, yep. Remember that one, yep. Yeah. All of these things, again, at the end of the day, are more likely where you start to question, oh, well, this trial didn't do very well. What was the point? Or, all the stuff that was over closer to the black walnuts looked really bad. And stuff farther away looked better. Well, okay, well, now I see I have a trial that shows the negative effects of black walnuts on these crops, but not telling me the differences between the varieties, which is what I really wanted to know. So ideally, the ideal situation is you find, good ground where basically if you drew, if you imagine putting your trial there, that pretty much the extent of that trial ground is pretty uniform from, front to back, side to side, that ground, has more or less the same soil type, has the same, prior crops on it. And ideally, if you're growing a large enough crop, one of the best things to do is, so say if you're growing a big, carrot crop, you would actually put that in the middle of your production field. And so the reason for that is that what you'd like to have is not just your trial, but you'd like to not have your trial at the edge of any fields. You'd like to have a border around it of that same crop. And the reason for that is because the edges are what gets, typically there's something, often unusual things happening on the edges. Again, it's maybe where the, right next to where the field road is and it has extra compaction, or, when the trucks take a turn, they start to nip off the corners of the field. It's where the irrigation doesn't quite reach as far. It's where, the compost wasn't quite spread all the way out to the edges. So if you just go ahead and say, okay, we're going to put it, in the middle of a field with a border of crop around it, well, if those edges start to have problems, you've still got really solid, good, ground that's been treated more or less uniformly in the middle. So looking for that field that's as uniform as possible. And then also trying to treat the trial as uniformly as possible. So again, this means applying your irrigation across the whole trial uniformly, fertilizing, cultivating, as uniformly as possible. What you don't want to do is say, okay, we got through half the trial, doing hand weeding, and we got busy, and then 3 weeks later we got around to weeding the other half of the trial. And so now all of a sudden you've got this difference because you had half of your trial that was a lot more stressed by weed competition for those 3 weeks. So if you're going to do something to your trial, you want to try and do it to the whole trial all at once. That being said, you want to be careful about not, you still want this trial to represent a real, as close to possible as a real production. You don't want to necessarily give this trial a lot of extra babying. You still want to, if there's a certain amount of fertilizer you apply, or a certain amount of times that you typically weed or water, you want to be doing pretty much the same things to your trial as you would be to your production. You don't want, often what you'll find is you'll find better, stronger differences between your trial once the crops start to undergo some degree of stress. When everything is treated really, really well in a trial, it can often be the case that you don't see as much of differences. And once you start to see more pressure, whether that's drought stress, weed competition, fertility stress, you start to see the ones that can still perform under those stresses, and then there's some that just fall off. Again, I would say, aim for something that's close to your typical production, because that's often the question that you're wanting to answer is, how well is this going to do for me? And so you want to treat it just like you would be another crop. So, gone through all this planning, how do you actually lay it out? What I would say is, you're wanting to lay out equal size, plots. This is what, we talk about in the world of trials as plots, which are, these short sections of row or beds or multiple rows that are all planted to the same thing. The size of these plots really depends on what crops you're growing with. A lot of it comes down to, you want to be harvesting enough of whatever it is that you're growing that you're not just pulling 3 beetroots and trying to make a decision on that. You want to be looking at enough material to feel like you've seen sort of the breadth of how that looks. The flip side is you want to have it small enough that you can manage it. And also sometimes, if you get into a really large trial, if you've got 60 plots, and each of those plots is 50 bed feet, all of a sudden the trial starts getting so big that it gets really hard to find a field that's actually uniform all the way across like that. And so you want to keep your plot small enough. The flip side of that is, as you narrow it down, so if, instead of looking at 15 or 10 or even 8 varieties, if you're only looking at maybe 1 or 2 or 3 new varieties and comparing them to sort of your standard variety, and you're trying to see little differences. Say you're trying to look at you're a carrot grower that's grows 100 acres of carrots, and you really care about your pack out weight, and you're trying to find something that just gets a little bit higher pack out than what you currently have. Then what you might want to look at is, instead of doing lots of little plots like this, doing what are called strip trials, where you plant your standard, and then right next to it, right next to it, you just plant the row of your what you're considering replacing it with, and there you can just have really, really long rows. And as long as they're side by side all the way down the field, you can go all the way across your field with 2 rows like that. And that lets you start to see really small differences in terms of traits that are hard to look at, like yield. So something else to keep in mind here, so looking at this, how this is, learn from painful experience. Whenever you do a trial, I would encourage you to, when you're mapping it, you want to do 2 things. Stakes or flags are really convenient. Having the name or number of what you're looking at out there in the field encourages you to make casual observations and make observations more frequently, because you'll just walk out there and you'll look and you'll be able to quickly make notes on things. That being said, you don't want to rely on stakes or flags alone to keep track of what's where. You really want to make sure that you have a map, either handwritten in a book, or on a spreadsheet in a computer, something that's not in the field, because these stakes break, the Sharpies wear off, the tractors run over them, mud splatters on them, and all of a sudden you can't read some plots, and you end up not being able to get as much useful information.
Yeah, I like to use the survey flags. I generally don't use the sticks. That's just my personal preference, and I don't label them. All I'm doing is, but I have a map. I absolutely rely on my map in my notebook. If I lost that, I'd be screwed. So, and the flags are nice. I can put them in quickly, and some of them do sort of get messed up during the season, but generally they're really easy to put in there, and I can just spot them right down the row.
Right, and they're cheap, and if you're careful, if you're careful about this, I mean, if you put your seed, well, if you have stakes like this, what I would say is, you're putting them right in line with wherever your seeded row is, and often you would actually tip these stakes the other direction so they're oriented with your row, so that way when you're cultivating you can get close without breaking the stakes. But the flags are even better that way. If you put those flags right in line, with your planted row, you can cultivate pretty close and not have to worry. But don't rely on them alone. Make sure you've got a backup somewhere, and hopefully more than one place.
Yeah, I just wanted to say about this one, I put this in not to show me again, because I guess I'm wearing my welcome on the slideshow here. But we use, that's a Jang precision seeder, which actually mimics a lot of seeders, that farmers mount on a toolbar. And so if we're in the middle of the farmer's field, I can plan almost exactly the way he or she is planting and get very similar spacing. It's a really nice tool, very precise for most seeds. Some stuff doesn't work so well, but most seeds, it works really great. And so I highly recommend a little precision seeder.
Yeah, I mean, the one of the challenges that that you often face in a trial, if you're tooled up to plant, normal, acreage of things, with direct seeded, how do you scale down from, something that's planting, 300-foot, rows to 10-foot rows, and planting things, that are, if you're growing 10 different things that all have 10 slightly different seed sizes, because you don't want to be dumping, 4 times as much seed in one plot than you are in the other one. The Jang is really nice for that, but the other way, I mean, plenty of people use other, push seeders, but what I would say is, if you're going to do it, take the time. The Jang does it for you more or less as far as precision, singulating seeds. But even if you're using like a planted junior, take the time and count out your seeds, just like you would be doing if you're planting long rows. Count out your seeds for each plot to make sure that you're planting the same, and then you can even sort of jump from one the plot of one variety over to that same variety in a different plot, so that way you don't have to switch the settings on your seeder before you switch around. Likewise, one of the things we've seen sometimes with, and this has been more in field crops with, like with grain drills and stuff, is that, there's often a little lag time before seeds really start dropping. And so you don't want to run out of plot before you really started getting up to your full seeding rate. So sort of, know that in advance. How long of a runway do you need? You might need to kind of get things primed a little before you start your plots each time.
Okay. Now you're getting into the evaluation of the trial. And boy, it's really hard when a lot of times, when I've said to a farmer, go ahead, would you, here's some varieties, go run a variety trial. And more often than not, the trial ultimately gets lost, or it's buried in the weeds on the edges. And a lot of times simply because the farmer just doesn't have enough time, or maybe it doesn't, they've got a lot of priorities and it's sort of on the bottom of the list. And so, Organic Seed Alliance has paid me to go out and do trials that maybe a farmer wouldn't be able to quite do it as thoroughly as I do it. But the information still needs to be gathered. If it's going to be at all meaningful, you can't just expect to plant the trial and then walk out there once, look at it, and that's it. So you really have to think about what is important. And the information I'm going to show is probably a lot of it the farmer won't really have time to gather, but ideally they could gather, that information.
Can I just jump in
Yes,
just really quick with that? Like Steve's saying, he's going to show you a lot of different ways to evaluate trials. Don't be intimidated. Just bite off what you think you can chew, and you can keep it really simple. There's a farmer I work with a lot who says, I don't really do trials, I just call them tries. And basically, what he means is he's trying things, and he keeps it really streamlined. He does, replicate. He'll plant, things 2 times, but a lot of times he's just pulling it up, and he's looking at, mainly one or two traits that he really cares about, and he's just doing what Steve's going to talk about as far as just a real kind of quick rating of things. He may not even be writing it down, but basically just saying okay, these are things I never really want to look at again. And these ones, okay, these look like these are, it's sort of like a 1, 2, 3. These are just thumbs down, never going to look at them again. These ones, maybe I'll look at them again. Oh, these ones look really good. These ones really stood out. I want to grow them again at larger scale. So it can be just as simple as that to as in-depth as what Steve's going to share.
So, there are, measuring versus scoring. So there's, measuring, actually getting a scale and weighing, or getting a ruler out and measuring. And I'll talk a little about that. And it has some valuable, there's some valuable information, obviously, from quantitative measures. But that, isn't always possible. So we've really employed a numerical ranking, sort of as our first set of information that we collect, as well as note taking. I'll talk a little about that more, but and then when those evaluations happen, because there's things change through the season, and it may only be one time that you have time to get in there. And in fact, when I'm doing trials on farms that are an hour or 2 hours away, I have to make the most of my days, and sometimes I can only get there once. So you got to choose what you can do on that day and what's the information you're going to get. And then some of the data collection tools, which I'll go into in a minute. But, and then everything, there's kind of like basic traits. And I'm sort of, my work has primarily been on vegetables. Jared actually has done a lot with quinoa, and he might want to share some of that as well. But this list here is kind of the standard list. That's usually the groups of typical traits that most every crop you're interested in. And we put quite a bit of emphasis on the culinary traits. Once it's been harvested, it's brought in. A lot of professional breeders don't really think about that part of it. In production ag, they're looking at yield, uniformity, and disease resistance, and flavor and texture. That's sort of down there on the list. But we make it a practice to try to bring it into the kitchen every time, because I think for us, we're really trying to promote varieties that are, everybody's going to want to eat. And, I think you can make a case for the correlation between good taste and good nutrition. And so this is sort of a typical set of traits. Now, then there's what I would call traits that we were interested in for organic farms. And really, it's a lot of these agronomic traits that really show how rugged a plant is or how resilient it is. And it's really important, particularly in organic farming, given that most of the nutrition is mediated biologically, so you have slow release of nutrients. You often have greater weed pressure than when you're talking about a chemical situation. Also, disease. You're not putting pesticides on these, and so we really want to know how these things hold up. And you could actually do. I have not yet done this on a side-by-side, but something like drought resistance. We can actually do that in California because it doesn't rain from April to November. So we could set it up to have a plot that never gets rain versus one that receives a certain number of irrigations through the season. These are, in weed competitiveness, we want to see the crop pop out of the ground and be able to handle all those weeds in there. So even though we are weeding it, I think these are all very important traits that I think as we go further into this and we select varieties that we want to bring into an organic farm, these are very useful traits for any farmer. And then, each crop has unique specific traits that are, kind of important just for them, like carrot tip fill. That's a lot of the blunted style carrots, the tip fill is a measure of maturity and how quickly it matures. Pepper, especially sweet peppers, sunburn is a huge issue, maybe the #1 issue for pepper growers. Winter squash, obviously storageability is a very important trait. Summer squash, it's more about like how easy it is to harvest the fruits. If you've ever grown like Black Beauty zucchini, the old heirloom, it's an incredibly productive squash, but man, you'd be cussing the developer of that one if you had to use that for your market. You get all cut up and it's just a gnarly thing, and so you're really looking for squash that'll be open habit and you can pick quickly. Cabbage, the inner core size. If you don't want to have a big core in there that's tough. Snap beans, harvest window is a really important one. I love provider beans, but they basically have about a 1-day harvest window, and then they get tough. And so we want to see varieties that we can extend that harvest for many days. And Jared told me it's a bean we've been promoting from Oregon State called OS Blues. I love it because it has a great harvest window, 7 to 10 days. It'll stay tender. Well, Jared found that out. Well, you might want to say something about that because, he had it, I guess 1 year it worked great for him, but then another year he had a warm season and his harvest window shrunk down to, only, I don't know how many days you had, but
less than 2 weeks, which is what
yeah,
we wanted.
Yeah, a lot less. And so that's just a lesson of you don't learn everything in one trial either. And every year is a little bit different. Onions, neck closure, and I'm going to talk about onions. That's one of the examples here that I'm going to cover. And then flour corns, the size of the kernels if somebody's milling it or making tortillas. So, so we've got the measuring traits, scales and rulers, and scoring traits. Now, we use a 1 to 9 scale, and the way it works is, we assign 1 for generally is the poorest of whatever that quality is you're looking at, and 9 being the best. And what we do is look at just the varieties in that trial. Like something in that trial is a 9, something's a 1. We're not thinking about some idealized variety or plant that's not in the trial. So you can't give everyone a 9, and you can't give everyone a 1. So it forces you. It's really a relative measure amongst those varieties that you're evaluating. And so, as you say, you always set the trial. So you've got your best, your worst, and then your middle, and then everything else kind of gets stuck in between. And it's a great way. I've found it to be the most effective way to get a lot of information very quickly.
Can I just say real
Yeah,
quick,
yeah.
as far as what's, just to clarify what Steve means by setting the trial, like a lot of the times what we would do is just walk the whole trial just fairly quickly, just looking for, okay, here's the best looking plot in the field. There's our 9. Walk around, here's the worst looking one. There's our 1, because sometimes it's just so confusing. Like if you're rating something with this sort of arbitrary numbering system, you just like, you could start out the day, and be really picky, and then by the end, you're like, oh, like it's easy to shift your numbering. But if you start with sort of like a real clear idea of this is the best, this is the worst, then you can move, to a 5. Okay, this is in the middle. And sometimes you can just give yourself and say, look, I'm only going to give it 3 numbers. I'm only going to give it, 9, 1, 5. But then maybe you start to feel more confident and you say, okay, well, this is actually, this is better than that 5, but not as good as the 9. Here's a 7. So you can start filling in the brackets, even into, oh, well, this was better than the 7, but not as good as the 9. There's an 8. So you start with those brackets and you can fill in the middle.
Right.
So basically, walk the trial once, trying to get that sense of what's best and worst, and then come back to the start and give your numbers.
So this is an example of an onion trial I ran on a commercial farm in Hollister, California, in 2015 and 16. And I mean, this is a pretty big grower here. He's a big wholesale vegetable grower. And you see those flags in there. Those are actually my individual plots, and each plot was actually 4 rows of onions that were 20 feet long. So I've got 80 row feet in a given plot. And a couple of things about this. One, you'll see how it's inserted right in the middle of the grower's trial. And in fact, he planted the whole rest of the trial that same day, while I was planting with my little young Jang cedar, same day. And I grew, and each one of those varieties was repeated twice. I had 2 reps, and for me, as Jared pointed out earlier, 3 reps would be great. You could actually even start publishing in a refereed journal if you had 3 reps. Well, I can't. I'm not really trying to publish my material in a refereed journal, but I do want it to be at least legitimate enough that I can feel confident. So I do 2 reps, mainly because that's about all that I can handle as me, myself, and I, and just limited resources. So each one of these varieties was repeated twice. So I've got 80 row feet per plot times 2, so I have 160 row feet of each onion variety in here. That's a large enough population. I think it ended up being like 600 onions, or 500 to 600 onions total for that variety. That was a large enough population that then I could take on the open pollinated varieties in here. I could select the best, and I agreed. My farmer cooperator agreed that this was fine. I selected like the top, say, 200 bulbs of the best open pollinated varieties, and I saved them back and stored them, and then gave them to different growers to start growing seed crops on. So I had an ulterior motive here. I mean, I had a secondary thing I was achieving. First was just doing a variety trial, seeing what varieties were better than others, so forth. And then secondly, the ones that I liked the best, I could go back and start reproducing them. And so now I've got I think I did it with like 6 of the varieties in this trial. And so now I've got these 6 baggies of different onions that now we can start testing them on other farms. Okay, so making sense of the data, and I'll use carrots in this example. First of all, quantitative measurements, and something. I mean, quantitative measurements are really great if you have the time to do it, and all these characteristics, just the count, the numbers of marketable. Now, what I was doing here, I laid them out, in a row there, and then just basically decided this is marketable, this isn't. So I just basically, I had a total population, and then I just determined what percentage by counting the number of marketable ones. And since I had all kinds of time, I did the weight per root, which is very important. And this is that's a difficult thing to rank on a numerical scale. So it was really valuable to have some of this quantitative data. The other thing that was very instructive is the average in-row root spacing. And this is the thing. A lot of crops, if you don't have even spacing in the row, it can skew your results. If your populations are too heavy, you might have a lot of little tiny roots. Or if the population is too sparse, you've got big roots, but the overall yield is very low because you've got a low population. So this helps you adjust. I mean, I try with the cedar to lay everything out evenly, but say with carrots, every one of these varieties are slightly different in size. Some of them are big, and the bigger ones fall out slower unless I have the exact plates. They're not plates, they're little cylinders or little, I don't know what you call them, these circles with grooves in them. And sometimes the ones that are tiny may fall out more densely. So I will, on these root crops like carrots, I will go through and try to do one weeding early and try to level the playing field. But that's very important when you're analyzing total yield. Okay, then qualitative measures are obviously things that we can't really, top height, I could get a measure on that, but much easier that I can actually go through and rank it when they're standing in the field. And same with top density. Those are traits that may be important if you're doing bunching carrots. The degree of blunting, and I'll show you in the next slide here what I mean by that, but again, a ranking, shoulder quality, we like to see shoulders, strong, square shoulders, and that's not really a measurable thing. I mean, it's a ranking, and of course, taste. All the eating evaluations are just, and they're actually mainly ranked on just writing notes about them. Now, the other thing I strongly recommend, if you can do it, if you actually have time, you take the time to do it, is getting a photographic record. Because oftentimes these rankings and stuff, they don't quite capture it all. So what I did with this is one of my carrot plots that I divided. You'll see the top 3 rows are the carrots that actually blunted, that actually fully blunted. And the bottom 2 were more or less pointed. You can kind of tell there. And so the numbers on the top represented the numbers in that population, the percentage in that population that actually was fully mature and ready to pull. So that gives me a very valuable piece of information about that variety. And then, of course, the flavor and taste evaluation, and you can't do this enough. I mean, every opportunity you can. We have a neighbor where I live in California. She's from Turkey, and she really appreciates good vegetables. I love her. She's great. And every time we have a tasting trial, she comes over, and she gives me descriptions that other people don't give me too. So I'd love to, if anybody has any tips on how to evaluate taste, I'd love to hear it. I think we need a tasting university or something, because we get comments like this tastes like dirt, or this tastes like pine cones or whatever it is. But and my niece is another one, very creative. She's not really thinking about vegetables, and oh yeah, I'll taste them, and she comes up with these descriptors that I've never heard before. And
so I say a couple of things real quick on taste, because it is so hard to to actually decide what tastes better and what doesn't. And a few things, I mean, it's a struggle is the moral of the story, but some things that you can do to improve it a little bit is, taste multiple fruits or roots, or, taste from multiple plants, because there's often differences. Think hard about where, if it's a carrot, where you're tasting, the, top's going to taste different than the bottom than the middle, so make sure that you're tasting in the same spot in all of them. Have, like Steve's saying, it's really valuable and important to have, as many people as you can tasting. And what I would say is when you have lots of people tasting, it's good. And depending on how many things you're tasting, think carefully, because taster fatigue is definitely a real problem in all of this. You'll be really excited about that first thing you taste, and that 20th thing is like really hard to be fair about it. So if you've got lots of people tasting it, shuffle the order around so that everybody's, so not everybody's all tasting in the same, order. So that way, because then everybody's going to have the same sort of thing of like, best at the beginning and down at the end. If you shuffle the order around, you'll have a little better chance of seeing things pop out that are actually good. But it's not easy. And different people have different opinions, which is why it's good to also have not just numbers but notes.
We did a trial at actually Carl Sutton's farm in Montana this summer, and we had a whole lot of people tasting them. And what I do a lot is like with carrots, because it's such a fibrous crop. I mean, I'll chew it a little and spit it out. A lot of people were disgusted by that. They didn't appreciate that I was spitting these out. But I'll tell you, with Jared said about taste fatigue, it's real. And you just have to kind of not get too carried away. And you'd think carrots would be a pretty good one, but man, you burn out. I mean, the hardest one I ever did was raw onions. Oh, God. John Navazio claims, he goes, oh yeah, there's a difference between harshness and pungency. Yep, you betcha, there's a real difference. But you got to be mighty courageous to pick up those differences. And I did some red onions, which are a little better than the yellows, and I did about 3, and I was pretty much down for the count after that. And I'm not sure if I could detect pungency from harshness. I'm not sure. So, but anyway, it's just something that I think would be great if we got more skilled at. Okay, I'm going to show you sort of an example of, this was the storage onion trial I showed you earlier in the field there. And boy, that's not very good, those top, it seems like that's, okay. I'll just tell you the categories going across. We've got.
You want me to change it real quick while you're talking?
Yeah, maybe so, because you really need to see what's on the top there. Now, what I did was, now this trial I actually included red storage onions as well. So when I'm doing my rankings, I actually rank them all together. So whether that was right or not, that's how I did it. So a lot of these, maybe the ones in a lot of cases were red onions. So that's why I'm not seeing quite the full range. I probably should have done another retake here and done all just yellows. But anyway, this is what I've got here. Maturity. These were the traits that I was evaluating here. Maturity, I was just basing it on 9 being early maturing and 1 being late maturing. This may not even be a very important trait for you. You could just toss this one out. If you think that this is irrelevant, remove it. Second one was total yield, which that one actually is an important trait. And what I did here was I actually weighed the entire plot. I got a weight, actual pounds, and then I actually did the numerical ranking later. So actually, this is not a subjective numerical ranking. This is actually based on data. The third column there, I have an adjusted yield. And I did this because some of the varieties were, like I was saying before, got more heavily planted. Some germed better than others. And even though I tried to do a little hand thinning, I had some very uneven populations. So what I did was I took what my ideal number of onions would be in like a plot, say like 360 onions, and then I multiplied it by the average weight of one onion in the trial to give my adjusted yield. So it's a little bit phony, but I felt like the total yield wasn't quite capturing it all. The fourth column is the percent of large bulbs. That's like 3 inch and above, because that's a very, very important market trait for onions. That's what wholesalers want, jumbos. And so that's, and my grower, he told me, he said, this is what I think it was anything below 2 1/4 inches. Those are in his coal pile. I know. Well, one man's trash is another one's gold, so to speak. So, but in his case, he was looking for jumbos. Percentage of disease, there's actually this farm had pressures of downy mildew and pink root, but neither one really was very severe. Mainly it was black mold, aspergillus, that came in later in the season, like 5 months into storage. And skin quality, just the tightness and nice looking wrappers. Neck closure, very important for having a long storing variety. You know what? I'm sorry.
The other one was double.
I'm sorry. My eyes. I got old eyes here. So yeah. Okay, I had percent doubles. I'm sorry. Is that middle column, and that's like some of the onions. You don't want onions to look like shallots, and because that compromises their storage ability. So that's that. Yeah, disease is about the 8th column over. Then storage ability, and what I did was I actually, the grower had an ideal storage of 34 degrees, and he could keep them for 6 months or 8 months. But I took a representative sample, brought them home, and kept them stored at 55 degrees, a less than ideal temp. And so that's the rating was based on the less than ideal. And some of them were getting black mold. And then what I did is I assigned the total yield and the adjustable yield and the storage ability twice. I doubled the scores for those because those to me were the 3 most important things. You can play around with the numbers and move it and manipulate it, but that's what I chose to do in this case. And as it turned out, so I get a total score on the right, and in this case, as it turned out, the growers, it was a hybrid variety called Camparo. It actually was the top variety, and but I was, and so he was growing the variety that was best for him. I mean, I couldn't argue with him. I was hoping that some of my varieties would be good, and a lot of them were pretty decent. But as I said, the jumbo question, the percent of doubles. If you look, it was 9 on that variety. So that was a really and that's basically in the world of onions. And I think this is true in several crops. When you decide whether to do an F1 hybrid or an OP, generally where the F1 hybrids are really, really at an advantage are, number one is the uniformity of large ones. I mean, at least there's a large number of the number 1 type. And I mean, they have higher yields, but disease resistance, maybe a little bit, maybe. It depended. I didn't have some of that, but those are the traits where the hybrid breeding has really shined, is the consistency of big, of kind of the number 1s. So that was sort of my take-home lesson in that. That other hybrid that Zoe listed there actually scored very high in every quality except skin quality. It's actually not really a keeper onion, and all the skins fell off of it. So that one got removed. But I had some of my others in here that looked very good, and I was really happy. And just that generally they were smaller. Okay. I'm not going to say this is just one of the eating score sheets we had with the carrots, and you'll see I did a numerical grading, but this, I have several times that I took notes. So, you see, oh my God, Nelson was last. I love that onion or carrot. But yeah, maybe another day, Nelson scored top. So so you have to just do it many times. Okay, and okay, so then I did basically with onions or with carrots. I do the same thing like I did with onions. I think Jared, you want to change that again? Somehow we lost our herd. We're in the wrong. But so I basically do the same grid with this crop, but different varieties. I mean, different traits that I'm looking at. So here, like pack out, I mean, which is really is a function of yield, but this is the number one. It's the stuff that's going to get taken out to sell. And tops, the top quality, the root quality, how smooth it is and attractive it is. Tip fill, what I mentioned before, that's a measure of how quickly mature. Color, a lot of the, some of them, the ones that are nice dark orange, I gave the top 9, and then when they were pale, that one was like a 1. Shoulder, some carrots you'll see have these pinch tops and don't look so good, and they got the lousy scores, and the good ones had nice square tops or shoulders. And so again, we have a score here. And so this really helps you get a good kind of a handle on where these things rank. And of course, all of them as well, you're writing notes too. I have sort of just a little narrative on each one.
I just want to just again, because these are big grids. Steve is ambitious, and this is what he's doing for a job. But if you're on your on a farm, I mean, think hard about like what's like the top 2 or maybe top 3 things that you're actually going to take the time for, and then the rest like. Just keep it, think about some other things that you want to take notes on, something really, I'm going to make sure and take, notes on this if it really stands out, and just have, that, column. I'll point out, as far as resources go, Organic Seed Alliance, our website, seedalliance.org, has a bunch of publications, including one on how to do on-farm variety trials, and we have a couple of really nice data sheets that you can use that have, basically make it really easy for you just to, just print it out. I use them all the time. Just print them out. You can go out in the field, just fill in, the variety names. It's got spots where you can have the, whatever traits you're rating, and then lots of room for the notes. So, I mean, just, think small is what I would say. Just, think about those top 2 or 3 traits that you're actually going to take the time to rate or rank or measure, and then the rest you're just going to make notes on if something really stands out. Right.
So I'll just show a third example I did was the conical sweet peppers. And those were my main, the quantitative measures, all these were measurements that I did, heights and dimensions. And then actually shelf life, I looked at like how many days after pick the peppers hold before the skins start decomposing. And then canopy cover was a qualitative measure. We just did a quick, so I had no way to really measure that. I suppose what you could do if you wanted to make it a quantitative measure is to harvest all your fruit and then count the number that had sun scald. Because really that's what you're really interested in. You're not necessarily interested in the best canopy cover, but canopy cover is a function of, it's one of the things that greatly influences sun scalding. So on an overall, we won't do it. That's all right, Jared. I have yield, canopy cover, storage, and flavor. So those are, again, you'll see them all there. And in this case, it's interesting that in this case I had 4 OPs and 4 hybrids, and the 4 OPs were the top 4, which is the first time I've ever had that happen in a trial. And 3 of them happened to be Frank Morton, and Frank's done an incredible job through some breeding of really creating some outstanding varieties that are pretty much every bit as good as any of the hybrids out there. So I was really encouraged to see that. And it's basically, a breeder, somebody who's a farmer who's kind of taking matters into their own hands and making a better variety. So that's something I hope that I can encourage as many people as possible can do that. The trials, 1 year is likely not definitive. In fact, it never is definitive. But it's probably good to run it a second year unless it's a real dog. But mostly you want to be testing them for at least a couple years. And each time you probably want to narrow it down. And then ultimately, after you've done a variety trial where you're screening several, then you may want to then enter into the next phase, which would be a marketing trial. And so you actually then take the seed of larger quantity to the grower, and maybe they grow a whole bed of that variety. So then they can bring it to their markets, bring it into their CSA baskets or their wholesalers. And because ultimately you want to gain some customers and have them grow varieties that are going to be great for their farm. So that's all I have. Did you want to say anything about the quinoa or any? No?
No, I think we're right on schedule for questions.
Okay. So anyway, thanks. Yeah.